Alright, so before we get started, we're going to need to import our model into the scene. So as I said in the last video, you'll need to download the 3D asset from a website. This website actually provides a free Creative Commons license, meaning that you can use this model for pretty much whatever you want, but just don't go selling this model as it's not yours. So once you do that, just make sure to download it as an STL file, and then you can follow along with the steps that I do here to import the model into the scene. So I'll just delete the default cube by pressing X and deleting, and then to import the model, go up to File, Import, and go to STL, which we have downloaded our model as. So I'll just navigate to where I saved it, and it is this one here. So just make sure to double click, and it should be in your scene. Just need to wait for it to load, and it is in our scene. However, you just need to scroll out, and there it is. Very big for a scene, but the first thing I'm going to do is click on Object, Set Origin, and set Origin to Geometry. So now the object is kind of in the middle, of the 3D cursor, or the 3D pivot point. And then what I can do is press S to scale down significantly, because we don't need it to be that big. And then also I'll just tab into edit mode and then press G and Z and move it up like so, just so that the origin is on the bottom of the model, the statue part here. So I'll just press G and Z and move it. This isn't too necessary, but it's just something that I like doing. Just one side note, if you are having trouble running this model, what you can do is go to the modifiers tab, add a modifier, and then add in a decimate modifier. So the decimate modifier pretty much just removes a bunch of geometry throughout the model. So it's at a ratio of 1, meaning that it's the original amount of vertices are in the model. However, if I change it to a 0.1, you will see that a lot of the detail in the model has been reduced. However, it still looks quite good, but as you can see when I zoom in, we can see we can see more of the individual faces. So if you want to save some processing power, what you can do is just change the ratio to like a 0.05 maybe. That reduces it even more. So this is where you might start losing detail. However, it makes things easier to manipulate and just work with. And once you're happy with the modifier, you can just click this tab here and click apply. But I don't need that, so I'll just get rid of the modifier. This is just so that even though you have less processing power, you can still follow along with the tutorial. So what I'll do is get the scene set up by clicking on our camera and positioning it to where I want it to be. I think this is actually quite an important thing to do early on, because a lot of our lighting kind of depends on where the camera is. So that's the first thing I'm going to do when setting up. So to just center it in the middle of the world, I will press Alt-G to clear the location, and then I will press Alt-R and clear the rotation. I'll go into right view. I need to just make sure that I'm mentioning that I press the tilde key, so that the button above the tab key on my keyboard, to navigate between different views. I feel like I don't say that enough. Maybe if you're jumping around between videos, that might not be clear. So since I don't have a numpad, I just use the tilde key to get the perspective that I want. You can use, if you have a numpad, you can use that to get around, but for me, I just use the tilde key, and it's quite quick to use. Anyway, getting back on track, I will press G and just drag it to about here. And then I will press R and 90, and then press the minus key to rotate it 90 degrees on the x-axis, but minus 90 degrees since it's going anti-clockwise. Then I'll use the tilde key and go into camera view. And then this is how our render will look if we decide to stick with the camera position and the resolution. However, since we're rendering a portrait, since we're rendering a portrait, it's important to have the correct resolution. So I want it to be a more, longer, more portrait instead of landscape type of camera view. So we can do this by going to the render properties and changing the resolutions. So the one that I like is the 1200 by 1500. So now you can see that our camera is taller than it is wide, and that is the thing that we're going for. Then what I'll do is just press G and Z to position it more or less in the camera, or position our model more or less, centered in the camera. However, there is one other thing that we need to change, which is the focal length. Now, the focal length is something that's quite important in cinematography. It's better that I just show you what it does instead of trying to explain it. But so if I turn the focal length down to something like a 15, you can see that it's pulled back quite a lot. So it's pulled back our perspective quite a lot, even though we're in the same position. However, if I press G and Y and then just hold the Shift key and start getting closer to my model, you can see that there's a lot of distortion. You can see that our camera is no longer making our image look, I guess, more lifelike. It's kind of bending its image to I guess, fit the type of focal length that it has. So that's what happens when you have a very short focal length. It's more likely to distort your image, and it gives this very funny, dynamic, and foreshortened look to it. So in portrait lighting and in portrait photography, typically we go for a higher focal length. So the one that I usually go for is about 85, and that's zoomed in quite a bit. And then what I can do is just press G and Y to bring it back like so. And as you can see, that gives us just more of a reasonable, more realistic looking image. So I'll just position it in the center. And actually, to help with the positioning of my camera, what I can do is just go into viewport displays, composition guidelines, and then enable center. And that just helps me see where the middle of my camera is. So I can click on the model here and then press G and X to shift it over ever so slightly. Since this model is asymmetrical, it's there's no real value in trying to get, I guess, it's perfectly centered. Just eyeball it and see what works for you. For me, I think having a similar edge between the shoulders and the camera is good enough for me. So we're almost done with the setup. The last thing that we're going to add in is the background, just so that we have, I guess, just a background. That's what is typically done in photography. There's always just a blank background, so that there's just your image to focus on. Or in this case, our subject would be the statue here. So just add in a plane, like I've done here, by pressing Shift A and add in a plane. And then what I can do is just tap into edit mode, scale it up, and scale it on the Z axis as well, making sure that the entire scene is just filled out like so. Okay, and then maybe I can just pull it back a bit, just so that there's more separation. Okay, all right, so I think now we are done with all of the setup and we can finally start lighting. It's just good to understand how you want to set things up if you're going to do lighting, because setup is also part of the process. So we can go into rendered mode by pressing the Z key and clicking on rendered. And as you can see, we are in Eevee rendered mode. And this is what we will be using for the majority of the tutorial until we finally switch to Cycles at the very end when we're happy with it. Because personally, I think the Cycles render engine is better at lighting, and that's the general consensus because it actually uses real life light bounce simulation. Essentially, it tries to mimic the way photons move. Try not to get too sciencey, but that's kind of what Cycles does for lighting. So the first thing we're going to do is just change some settings so that we can start working with our lighting. So the first thing I'll do is change the world strength to 0. So that means that there is no light coming from the entire world, and currently the only source of light is this point light. So hopefully you're familiar with the point light, something that I discussed in the previous video. It's just an omnidirectional light that we can change in the light settings, as you can see here. We can bring down the strength, we can change the color, all this stuff. However, we're not going to use it in this video, so we will press X and delete the spotlight. So as you can see, there's no light in the scene, and we can start creating our lights by just pressing Shift A and adding a light and adding an area light. So as you can see, a very weak area light with a power of 10 and a color of white. So to explain what we're going to be doing, we're going to just light our model using a 3-point lighting system, a very common type of lighting setup used in cinema and I guess photography. There's three main lights, as the name suggests. There's the main light, I would say, or the key light, the backlight, and then we have the fill light. So the first light we're going to work on is the key light. So this is going to be, I would say, the main source of lighting for our model. So what we can do is just go into top view by using our tilde key or the numpad, and then press R and X to rotate it on the X-axis. So I'll just rotate it towards the model. And what I'll do is just go into solid mode, because right now we're just trying to position our area light. So we want it to be pointed on our model. And we can actually do this by pressing Shift T and just pointing it towards our model like so. I kind of want it to be shining on this side of the face. So just press Shift T and then just move it over like so. And then I will go into camera view to see how that looks. Oops. Okay, so it's a very weak light, and what we can do is just bring up the strength, maybe to like, let's try a 50 for now. So as you can see, we have this side of the face being illuminated quite nicely. And then as you can see, the other side of the body of the sculpture is in almost complete darkness. And this is where our fill light will come through. So basically the fill light fills in the shadows of your model. So we can just do this by pressing Shift D and duplicating our light and then rotating it towards the model like so, and then going into camera view. So as you can see, we just have a very neutrally lighted model, which doesn't make for very interesting lighting. So typically the area lights for the fill lights is going to be a lot weaker. For me, I usually go 50% or lower. This is so that we have a bit more contrast between the key light and the fill light. So if I bring this down to like a 25, we get more of those interesting shadows as seen before, and we still have the highlights of the key light. So what I'll do is just bring this up here and then rotate it like so, and just see how that looks. Again, I feel like having a bit more contrast makes for a more interesting render. So we can bring down the power even more to maybe like a 15. I think that might be a bit too small, so maybe 20. And it's all about experimenting. Also, as a side note, don't directly copy my numbers if it doesn't seem to be working for you. Lighting is also dependent on the size of your model. So maybe you have a different size to your model than me, and that means you might need to be using stronger lighting because you're lighting a larger object. The opposite is also true. So if you have a smaller object, maybe you just need to decrease the light. Okay, so we have the fill light, and what I'll do for the fill light is actually increase the size to like a 1.75, just so that it has more light spread out. And maybe what I can do is just bring it in closer, because again, we don't want like complete areas of darkness. However, we just want there to be a contrast between the key light and the main light, or the key light and the fill light, I should say. And then finally, the last light that we're going to add in is the backlight. This is one of my favorite lights to add in because I just think it's a really cool effect that we can get in portrait lighting. So just press Shift D on this area light, and then press Shift T to point your light towards the back of our character's head. And then press G and just move it back like so. And then I'll say place it around here, and then go back into rendered mode. So as you can see, we have this nice little light streak going around the neck and coming up to the head. And one thing I like doing to just properly see its effect is by clicking on our fill light and just going into rendered mode once again and hiding it just to see what our backlight is actually doing. So as you can see, we have a subtle little halo, or I guess shine, around our character's body here. And what I can do actually is just bring up the strength of the backlight, maybe like a 35. We can see how that looks.